He humiliated a black man in front of the entire first-class cabin, sneering that people like you don't belong up here. But what this pilot didn't realize was that the man he just degraded held the power to rewrite the future of the entire airline. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was deliberate, public degradation delivered with full confidence and zero consequence. Until the tables turned. No one stepped in. No one questioned it. The crew backed him. The gate agent looked the other way. And the man at the center of it all? He stayed silent. Not because he was weak, but because he was waiting, watching, documenting. And when the plane landed, everything unraveled. This wasn't just another case of quiet racism swept under corporate carpet. It became a story that forced an entire industry to face the mirror. You might think you know how this ends. You don't. Watch closely, because this isn't just one man's flight. It's the flight that changed everything. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done if you'd been on board? Tell us in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more real stories with real consequences. The departures terminal at Houston International buzzed with the usual mid-morning rush. Business travelers speed walking toward their gates, families wrestling with luggage, and flight announcements crackling overhead. In the middle of this controlled chaos moved Thomas Reed, a 68-year-old black man with a slow but deliberate gait. His hand gripped the curved head of a mahogany cane, and though his steps were measured, there was a quiet confidence in every movement. Dressed in a pressed olive coat, dark slacks, and polished loafers, Thomas didn't look like someone lost in the airport crowd. He looked like someone with purpose, though the world around him seemed unwilling to see it. As he reached the Skylux Airlines priority boarding desk, he paused briefly and addressed a nearby attendant with a courteous nod. "Excuse me, would you mind assisting me up the boarding ramp? Bad hip from my service days. I don't want to hold anyone up." The attendant nodded with mild surprise and stepped away to make the request. But before the support staff could respond, a voice from across the gate sliced through the ambient noise. "If you need someone to hold your hand, maybe you should be taking a bus instead." The words didn't shout, but the impact landed like a slap in front of every nearby traveler. Heads turned, some chuckled, others looked away. The speaker, Captain Craig Walton, was a tall, sharp-featured white man in his early 50s, already wearing his navy blue uniform with 4 gold stripes stitched proudly across each sleeve. His expression was one of thinly veiled disdain, the kind bred from years of unchecked arrogance. He didn't flinch. He just looked directly at Thomas, as if daring him to respond. Thomas didn't blink. His eyes, dark and calm, met Craig's. "I wasn't asking for special treatment, Captain. Just courtesy," he said with controlled firmness. Craig stepped forward with a patronizing smirk. "Courtesies earned in first class, sir. We're running a flight, not a care home." He turned away before Thomas could answer. "Let's get this man situated, somewhere he won't disrupt the premium section," Craig muttered, loud enough for others to hear. The gate agent's fingers hovered uncertainly above the check-in screen. "Sir," she said awkwardly to Thomas, "may I see your boarding pass again?" Thomas handed it over without hesitation. "Seat 1A. The agent hesitated as the system loaded. When she read it, her face paled slightly. She glanced toward Craig but said nothing. "Looks like that's correct." Craig leaned over her shoulder. When he saw the assignment, his jaw tensed. "Must be an internal system glitch," he said dryly. "He's not listed under premium loyalty." The agent replied, "It's a fully paid first-class ticket. Booked 6 weeks ago." Craig's eyes narrowed. "I'll handle this." He stepped back toward Thomas. "Mr. Reed, I'm afraid we'll need to reassess your seating. There's been an issue with your boarding clearance. You'll need to wait." "Wait for what exactly?" Thomas asked, his voice still low, still composed. "Wait while we verify your eligibility for this section," Craig said, not bothering to mask the implication behind his words. "This isn't personal. It's a matter of maintaining order in our top-tier cabin." "Order?" Thomas echoed. "You're suggesting my presence threatens order?" Craig smirked again. "Let's not escalate, sir." A few passengers nearby were pretending not to stare, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Thomas remained where he stood, cane in hand, unmoving. "I've flown over 4 million miles in my lifetime," he said slowly, "and I've never once been told my presence was disruptive. Until today." Craig crossed his arms. "This is a private carrier. Discretion is part of the service. If that's a problem, we can arrange alternate transport." "Alternate?" Thomas asked. "Are you denying me boarding?" Craig gave a tight nod. "Until we clear this up, yes. You'll wait at the side." Silence fell around them. The nearby line of business travelers stiffened. A young woman with a toddler looked visibly uncomfortable. No one spoke up. Not yet. Thomas didn't argue. He nodded once and stepped away from the gate, his face unreadable. But in his eyes, behind the calm exterior, something cold and deliberate had begun to crystallize. Whatever Craig Walton thought he was protecting, whatever illusion of exclusivity or superiority he clung to, he had just crossed a line, and he didn't even know it. No one had updated him. He could still hear the soft mechanical chime of final boarding calls for other flights echoing overhead. But for his flight, Skylux 371 to Denver, there was only silence. Passengers had all boarded. The concourse was nearly empty now, and Thomas was still there, exiled from his rightful seat, a first-class ticket in his jacket pocket and dignity-tested, but not broken. Just as he was about to step back toward the counter to reassert his claim, a new face approached. A young woman, early 30s, platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, walking with the crisp pace of someone trained to smile through discomfort. Her name tag read Ashley Flight Service Coordinator. She greeted him with a courteous but clipped tone. "Mr. Reed, I apologize for the delay. There's been a minor update to your seating." Thomas's brow furrowed slightly. "An update?" She nodded quickly, avoiding direct eye contact. "Due to a reassignment process during check-in, your seat has been adjusted to 29C. Thomas remained motionless, processing her words with careful restraint. 29C is an economy, he said calmly. "That's correct, sir," Ashley confirmed, her smile tightening. "We apologize for the confusion." "There's no confusion," Thomas replied, producing the boarding pass. "This says 1A. Booked. Confirmed. Paid for in full." Ashley glanced at the pass, then at her tablet. "Our system just pushed a reassignment during check-in. We're at full capacity in first class, unfortunately. But we'll be happy to offer you complimentary beverage service as a courtesy." She said it like she was offering a band-aid for a bullet wound. "And who exactly reassigned my seat?" Thomas asked, voice sharper now. Ashley paused for the briefest second. "The system's algorithm sometimes makes last-minute seat adjustments for operational efficiency." Thomas held her gaze. "Which means someone changed it manually." She didn't answer. That was all the answer he needed. Moments later, as he was escorted down the jet bridge by a silent attendant, Thomas took note of the surrounding energy, the side glances, the hushed murmurs, the quiet shift of posture among crew members who had clearly been briefed on the situation. He stepped onto the plane and was ushered past the spacious, luxurious rows of first class. There in 1A sat a sharply dressed man in his 40s with a Rolex peeking out from his sleeve and a glass of champagne already in hand. Craig Walton stood at the cabin entrance, arms folded, eyes watching as Thomas passed by. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just a stare that made it clear this wasn't just policy, it was personal. Thomas continued on without a word, taking his cramped seat between a window and a man eating peanuts like it was a timed event. He sat down, adjusted his jacket, and inhaled deeply. From his front pocket, he pulled out his notebook and flipped to a fresh page. But before he could write, he heard the unmistakable static of a radio behind him. Craig's voice, unmistakable even in low volume, came through from the cockpit door just a few rows ahead. "Gate security, this is Captain Walton. We've got a potential seating issue. There's an individual on board who may have attempted to claim a seat not assigned to him. We're reviewing manifest now. Just giving you a heads up in case we need support." The insinuation was subtle, but lethal. A seating issue with a black man quietly complying in economy. Thomas heard it all. So did the nearby passengers. The white woman in 29 be shifted in her seat. The man across the aisle raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Thomas said nothing too. He opened his notebook again and wrote in slow, meticulous cursive. They took the seat, then the story. The lie is louder than the truth today, but only for now. Up front, the man in 1A was laughing about something. Probably a joke told by Craig or one of the crew. Laughter traveled easy when no one asked questions. Thomas's hands were steady, but his jaw clenched ever so slightly. He had seen these plays before. In boardrooms, in banks, in ballot lines. It was always the same choreography: deny, redirect, discredit. But this time, they had picked the wrong man. They thought they were silencing a passenger. They didn't know they were silencing the man behind the very initiative the airline was trying to secure funding for. They didn't know he had already spoken with 5 of their board members earlier that week. They didn't know this trip was never meant to be silent. The engines whirred to life. Flight attendants went through the safety demonstration. Craig's voice came through the PA system, warm, professional, rehearsed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Skylux 371. We're looking at smooth weather all the way into Denver. Sit back, relax, and thank you for flying with us. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, replaying the sequence of the morning like a film reel. He opened them again, more alert than ever. This wasn't just a case of mistaken seating. His pen moved steadily across the page, the ink gliding in straight, elegant strokes. Each word carefully chosen, each line a record of the insult he had endured, the details as vivid as the sting of Craig Walton's words. His back was straight, his face unreadable, but his hands wrote with the calm deliberation of someone building evidence. Across the aisle, a businessman in his late 30s, wearing a Bluetooth earpiece, leaned slightly to peek at the notebook, curiosity glinting in his eyes. He couldn't quite read the text, but he smirked, nudging the passenger beside him. "Look at that," he muttered with a quiet chuckle. "He's writing a complaint like it's 1992. Laughter bubbled under the breath of a few nearby passengers. One of the flight attendants walking past noticed, paused, and leaned closer to catch a better look at Thomas's writing. She straightened, turned, and made her way up the aisle toward the front of the plane. Moments later, just behind the curtains separating first class from the rest, the laughter returned, only louder now, more brazen. Craig Walton's voice rose above the others, casually amused. "You should have seen his face when we bumped him. Pulled out that notebook like he's drafting some grand manifesto. Probably thinks he'll get a voucher or something." The others snorted in response. One of them, Rachel, the brunette flight attendant who had avoided Thomas's eye at the gate, added, "I think he's logging every minute like he's preparing for court." Craig replied without missing a beat, "Let him. These types always do. Think being loud and dramatic gets them special treatment." Then came the line that silenced the chuckles for a moment. One of the younger flight attendants, clearly new, asked cautiously, "Do you think he's someone important?" There was a brief pause, followed by Craig's unmistakable scoff. "Important? Please. Old black guy with a cane and a notebook? Nah, he's just another one of those grandpas who watched too many courtroom dramas. Probably thinks he's flying to D.C. to testify before Congress." He laughed again, louder this time. "Hell, he probably tells people he used to be a Tuskegee airman." Rachel tried to suppress her grin, but failed. "Do they even still teach that in school?" Craig leaned back in the jump seat and crossed his arms. "Doesn't matter. These folks love playing the victim. That notebook? Just another prop." Meanwhile, back in row 29, Thomas stopped writing mid-sentence. His posture hadn't changed, but his ears caught every word. He knew the volume of airplane acoustics. He knew sound traveled differently on board, especially when said by people who thought they were safely behind curtains. He closed his notebook with a soft click and slid it into the inner pocket of his blazer. He reached into the side of his leather bag and pulled out his phone. No calls, no messages. But that didn't matter. He wasn't ready to act yet. First, he had to let them keep going. Let them pile on the arrogance. Let them feel untouchable. A flight attendant passed again, this time avoiding eye contact completely. as if Thomas's presence was now an inconvenience she wished would vanish. The man across the aisle leaned in again, emboldened by the murmurs he'd overheard. "Hey, no offense, man," he said in a tone that suggested he felt magnanimous for speaking. "But if you wanted real VIP treatment, maybe fly with someone who knows you." He gestured casually toward the front of the plane. "Up there? That's where the real money sits." Thomas turned his head slowly toward him. His gaze was calm, but behind it burned the slow, rising fire of a man collecting receipts. "Thank you," he said simply, voice even. The man seemed slightly thrown by the lack of anger and settled back into his seat with a shrug. At the front, the curtain rustled again, and Craig emerged into the first-class cabin, walking confidently down the aisle as if he were royalty inspecting his kingdom. He shared a smile with the man in 1A, now enjoying a second glass of champagne, and made a joke loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Had to make some adjustments. Seems like people keep forgetting what first class actually means." The man laughed, clinking his glass. "Glad you keep the standards high, Captain." Craig nodded with mock humility. "Somebody has to." As he returned to the cockpit, the man in 2B, an older white passenger with salt and pepper hair and a quiet, observant demeanor, watched Craig walk past with narrowed eyes. He hadn't said anything yet, but something in his gaze suggested he'd been listening closely. Thomas opened his phone again, tapped open his encrypted messages, and drafted a short note. "Update. They've made it personal. Let them keep talking." "Apologies for the delay, folks," he said, voice dripping with affected charm. "We're running a little behind because one of our more, let's say, determined passengers couldn't quite accept that they're not as important as they thought." His eyes flicked toward the back of the plane, subtle as a dagger. First-class passengers exchanged glances, and a few chuckled quietly, assuming this was just the usual captain sarcasm. But not everyone laughed. The man in seat 2B, the one with the salt and pepper hair who had observed Craig earlier, frowned deeply and glanced over his shoulder as if trying to see who exactly was being mocked. Row 29 remained silent, but Thomas Reed had heard every word. He didn't flinch. He didn't react. Instead, he lifted his phone slowly, pretending to check the time, while simultaneously enabling the record function and slipping it onto his tray table camera up, discreetly angled. He had no interest in becoming a spectacle, but when someone weaponized public embarrassment against you, the smartest counter was not rage. It was documentation. 2 rows ahead of Thomas, a young woman in her 20s with a denim jacket and box braids was less subtle. She'd been watching the tension unfold since the gate and had started recording the captain's announcement from the moment she sensed it would turn ugly. Her phone was angled just enough to capture Craig's voice from the cockpit door and the audible reactions of the passengers around her. She zoomed slightly, catching Craig's dismissive smirk as he disappeared behind the curtain again. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared at her side, eyes flicking between her phone and her face. "I'm going to have to ask you to delete that video," the attendant said in a low but stern voice. "Why?" the woman asked, not aggressively but firm, thumb still resting on the screen. "That's for my protection and his." The attendant leaned in. "Recording crew without consent violates airline policy and federal privacy regulations. You'll need to delete it now, or we'll have to involve the air marshal." That caught the attention of nearby passengers, some of whom turned to look at the young woman, others shifting uncomfortably. "So let me get this straight," she said, not raising her voice. "He gets to humiliate a passenger over the intercom, and I'm the one violating protocol?" The attendant didn't answer directly. Instead, she extended her hand, palm up. "Delete it now, please." The woman hesitated, glancing back at Thomas, then reluctantly ended the video and deleted the file in front of the attendant. As the crew member walked off, satisfied, the woman leaned forward toward Thomas. "They're trying to erase the only truth that ever gets heard," she whispered. Thomas gave her a slight nod, grateful but unreadable. She didn't know that he, too, had captured what mattered. She didn't know that his phone had recorded the exact moment Craig's voice, laced with disdain, became a confession of prejudice broadcast across a cabin. The irony was thick. They had stripped him of his seat, mocked his presence, and now they were trying to erase the proof that any of it had happened. But truth, as Thomas knew from experience, had a way of surfacing no matter how many curtains they drew or threats they made. Up front, Craig sat smugly in the captain's seat, chuckling with his first officer. "Did you see the look on his face back there?" he said, voice muffled but audible to the cockpit mic, like he thought we were going to apologize. The first officer didn't respond. He glanced at the flight instruments, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I just hope this doesn't come back to bite us," he said quietly. Craig waved a hand. "Please. The only thing that bites is when you give in to that performative guilt. I've been flying 26 years. You know how many of these so-called incidents actually amount to anything?" He grinned. 0. Back in 29C, Thomas Reed was still. Outside the window, the sky had begun to brighten, streaks of dawn light casting thin gold over the wings. He looked out at the horizon, then down at his watch. 32 minutes since they'd closed the cabin door. 28 minutes since Craig's first snide comment. 12 since the broadcasted insult. For since they tried to erase the record. His fingers moved across the phone screen again, attaching the audio clip and typing a short message. "Do not respond. For record only. Misconduct confirmed." He saved it, again not sending. Patience was his weapon now. Across the cabin, passengers whispered in low tones. A few had grown clearly uncomfortable, though no one yet had spoken up. In first class, the laughter had faded into tension. Around him, the air felt heavier than before, not because of turbulence, but because of awareness. People had heard the captain's earlier announcement. People had seen the tension unfold. And now, even those who had once chuckled nervously or ignored it entirely were glancing over at Thomas, unsure whether to feel complicit, concerned, or cautious. The young woman who tried to record earlier looked over again, her brows furrowed in a quiet mix of frustration and shame, not because she deleted the video, but because of how easily she had been made to. A silence hung over the moment like a fog, one that thickened when Craig Walton re-emerged from the cockpit, walking casually down the aisle with his hands behind his back. He didn't look at Thomas as he passed. He didn't have to. The smirk on his face was enough to suggest the performance was still in progress. A few rows ahead, he stopped and leaned down slightly to speak to one of the attendants in hushed tones. The conversation was short, punctuated by a quick glance toward row 29 and a dismissive nod from Craig. Then he turned and walked back to the cockpit without a word. Moments later, the drink cart began rolling down the aisle, stewarded by Rachel and a junior attendant named Dennis. They served rows 21 through 28 with routine efficiency, their smiles rehearsed and their tone cheerful, asking each passenger what they'd prefer: coffee, tea, orange juice, wine. But when they reached row 29, the routine shifted. Rachel looked at Thomas briefly, then lowered her gaze and moved the cart forward. Dennis hesitated for half a second, clearly unsure whether they were skipping intentionally or by mistake. He leaned in and whispered, "Would you like?" But Rachel cut him off. "We'll come back to this row," she said sharply, wheeling the cart past Thomas without acknowledgement. It was so deliberate, so performative, that even the man in 29A looked confused, glancing between the attendants and Thomas with a subtle tilt of his head. Thomas didn't move. He simply said, softly but clearly enough for the rows around him to hear, "You can tell the captain I didn't come here for orange juice." The words were calm, not confrontational. Yet somehow, they echoed louder than any demand. A ripple of silence followed. Rachel stiffened. She didn't turn back. A few seconds later, the cart was gone, and service resumed behind them. Several rows up, Craig's voice came through the PA again, this time feigning formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Our flight time to Denver will be approximately 1 hour and 32 minutes. We ask that you relax, enjoy the ride, and remember, premium service is reserved for those who qualify." The last sentence wasn't in any airline manual. It wasn't part of any protocol. It was a message meant only for one man, and everyone around him knew it. Thomas didn't react, at least not outwardly. But from the seat next to him, the man in 29B, A middle-aged programmer from Austin, who'd been watching with growing unease, leaned over and whispered, "Sir, I don't know what's going on, but this doesn't feel right." Thomas turned to him, expression calm. "It's not," he said, "but it's expected." "Why aren't you saying something?" the man asked. Thomas paused, then answered, "Because I'm not here to win a seat. I'm here for something bigger." The man blinked, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked ahead, toward first class, toward the cockpit, toward the crew, who had already written him off. "I'm here to observe," he said, "to let them believe their illusion long enough to hang themselves with it." The man said nothing else, but his eyes lingered, more curious now than ever. Near the front of the plane, Craig leaned back in his seat, laughing quietly as Rachel returned to update him. "He said he didn't want juice?" Craig asked, smirking. "What's next? Maybe he's here to buy the whole airline." He laughed again, loud enough that Dennis winced. "We should give him a brochure, see if he wants to invest." Rachel chuckled softly, though it sounded forced. Craig leaned forward again, more serious now. "Make sure he stays quiet. No service, no attention. Let's not give him a platform. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until we've reached the gate." Thomas Reed didn't need the reminder. He sat perfectly still in 29C, upright and composed, watching the skyline of Denver come into view through the oval window. The majestic silhouette of the Rockies rested behind the horizon like a quiet witness to everything that had happened at 36,000 feet. Around him, the cabin buzzed with a low rustle of passengers preparing for landing. Phones came out, seats adjusted, bags nudged into laps. Even those who hadn't interacted with him during the flight were stealing glances now, aware that something unusual had transpired, even if they didn't fully understand what. Thomas closed his notebook slowly, tucked it back into his leather satchel, and waited. The touchdown was smooth, the wheels kissing the runway with a soft double bump as the engines reversed and the aircraft slowed. A few passengers clapped out of habit. Most remained silent. The captain did not speak again. Instead, the plane taxied to Gate C-18, where the jet bridge was already waiting. As the fastened seatbelt sign blinked off with a tone, passengers began rising, stretching, grabbing their bags from the overhead bins. In first class, Craig Walton emerged from the cockpit with his usual swagger, planting himself at the cabin door with Rachel just behind him. They greeted passengers one by one as they exited, smiling, thanking them for flying, nodding to familiar faces. "Thanks for flying, Skylux. Hope you enjoyed your flight. Safe travels now." But as Thomas slowly made his way forward from the back of the plane, last in line, unhurried, Craig's smile vanished. His arms dropped to his sides. His stance shifted. When Thomas reached the cabin door, Craig turned his head slightly away, said nothing, and let him pass without acknowledgement. Not a word, not a glance. Rachel glanced between the two men, visibly uneasy. Thomas didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply walked past them with the quiet grace of someone who no longer needed to answer small men with big egos. But what came next pierced through Craig's forced silence like a gunshot. Just beyond the jet bridge, in the bright, polished hallway of Terminal C, a young ground operations officer in a charcoal blazer jogged up breathless and wide-eyed. He nearly skidded to a stop in front of Thomas and blurted, "Mr. Reed, we're so sorry for the confusion. If you'll follow me, we have a private room prepared for your press coordination. They're waiting for you upstairs." The sentence struck the air like lightning. Passengers around them slowed. A few stared. Craig's brow furrowed visibly from the threshold of the aircraft. Rachel leaned forward slightly, as if she'd misheard. Thomas nodded to the man, eyes calm. "I appreciate that." The operations officer, who wore a lanyard with Corporate Affairs Liaison printed in blue under his badge, gestured down the terminal. "Right this way, sir. Mr. Hamilton from the board is already en route, and the press crew from CBS is setting up. They said you'd want to address the discrimination matter directly, and we've prepared the statements exactly as your legal team outlined." At that moment, the buzz of the terminal seemed to fade. Craig Walton stood frozen at the cabin door, mouth slightly parted, still processing what he'd just heard. "Legal team," he repeated under his breath. Passengers in first class had stopped at the gate, half exited, now turning back to stare in disbelief. One whispered to another, "Wait, who is that guy?" A man in business attire pulled out his phone. Rachel looked pale. Craig stepped off the plane, eyes locked on the retreating figure of Thomas walking confidently beside the liaison, led toward the glass elevator at the end of the concourse. "Reed," Craig muttered, his voice quieter now, like he was saying the name for the first time with real weight. "That's Thomas Reed?" Rachel swallowed hard. "The guy they keep talking about on the executive memos? The guy heading the veteran-led aerospace fund," Craig added slowly. "The one meeting with our board this week." His voice trailed off, drowned by the sound of the elevator chime. Beside him, the liaison from Skylux Corporate Affairs guided him down a private corridor, past a pair of uniformed security guards, and into a waiting room flanked by journalists, videographers, and a cluster of sharply dressed executives. Outside the frosted glass doors, the emblem of Skylux Airlines gleamed on a tall backdrop already prepared for press coverage. At the center stood a slim black podium, wired for microphones from CNN, CNBC, and local affiliates. The murmurs stopped when Thomas entered. Heads turned. Flashbulbs pulsed. A woman with a clipboard stepped forward and greeted him by name with the kind of deference reserved for heads of state. "Mr. Reed, welcome. We're ready when you are." Thomas offered a single nod. No words, just presence. He handed his coat and satchel to a nearby aide and moved toward the podium. Every step was deliberate. Every camera turned to capture the moment. Outside, hundreds of thousands were already watching the live stream via the airline's press channel, which had been redirected just minutes earlier from a scheduled announcement about strategic fleet modernization. What the viewers got instead was something no PR team could have planned. The moment Thomas reached the microphone, silence fell. Behind him, Skylux's regional director, head of operations, and interim CEO stood shoulder to shoulder, faces strained but respectful. Then came the introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This morning, we welcome Mr. Thomas Reed, decorated Air Force veteran, founder of the Reed Aerospace Initiative, and managing chair of the National Equity Transportation Fund, currently negotiating a proposed $1.1 billion private investment into Skylux Airlines to upgrade and diversify its entire commercial fleet over the next 5 years." The room shifted. Reporters blinked. Pens hovered midair. Even the camera crews paused momentarily, stunned by the gravity of what they'd just heard. Thomas stepped up, cleared his throat, and began. "Before I speak as a partner or investor, I speak today as a passenger, one who paid for a ticket, boarded with dignity, and was met with something no one flying any airline should ever experience: prejudice masquerading as protocol." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "On this morning's flight, I was questioned, mocked, humiliated, and denied basic service, not because of what I did, but because of what I look like. The pilot, Captain Craig Walton, made disparaging remarks about my presence, refused my seating assignment, and authorized the crew to ignore me as if I were invisible." Across the room, screens lit up as a video feed was cued. This was captured by a concerned passenger before security forced her to delete it. Fortunately, her backup auto-synced. The monitor behind Thomas flickered, then displayed the clip. Craig's voice rang through the speakers with chilling clarity. "We're delayed because one old man doesn't know he's not important." Murmurs turned to gasps. The second clip followed, Craig mocking, "Maybe he's here to buy the airline," accompanied by the laughter of flight attendants. The sound played like a blade. And then the final line: "Premium service is for those who qualify." No music, no edits, just raw evidence. The feed cut, and Thomas looked directly into the crowd. "Skylux talks about modernization. I came here to fund it, not just in aircraft, but in culture. Because an airline is more than its planes. It is its people. And how those people treat others matters more than what hangs in the sky." On social media, the hashtag Justice in the Skies had begun trending within 6 minutes of the broadcast. By minute 12, over 200,000 tweets had echoed the clip. Civil rights groups reposted it. Influencers amplified it. Public figures weighed in. Headlines began to form. Veteran investor humiliated mid-flight. Owns airline deal. On the airport's lower floor, Craig Walton was still in uniform, standing outside the crew briefing room, frozen in front of a large television bolted to the terminal wall. The broadcast was playing live. He watched as his own voice mocked the man now being called the most poised face of corporate accountability. Rachel, the lead attendant, stood behind him, pale as paper. She clutched her phone, reading the wave of messages flooding in from friends and colleagues, some condemning, some shocked, all watching. A reporter's voice on the live stream added the final blow. Captain Walton's statements have been submitted to the FAA and the Skylux Board of Ethics for immediate review. While passengers and viewers around the world continued to share, quote, and dissect the footage, a very different kind of conversation was taking place in the 14th floor conference room of Skylux's Denver executive wing. The boardroom, normally a space of quiet control and calculated negotiations, had erupted into tension. Phones buzzed. Legal counsel whispered into ears. PR officers held their breath while rapidly drafting a new round of statements to counter the firestorm. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Bryce, the interim CEO and one of the few voices that hadn't cracked under pressure. She stood and addressed the room, her tone clipped but firm. Effective immediately, she announced, Captain Craig Walton has been suspended without pay pending a formal review. If we don't act decisively, we won't have a brand left to protect. She turned toward the communications director. Draft a full, unconditional apology. Not for the press, for Mr. Reed. Personally, I want his name, his title, and every ounce of the truth in that statement. Understood. The director nodded, already typing. At that very moment, the Skylux homepage was replaced with a red banner at the top. We sincerely apologize to Mr. Thomas Reed. Discrimination has no place in our skies. An investigation is underway, and corrective action has begun. Downstairs in the private lounge, Thomas sat in a calm silence, sipping tea, his cane resting beside him. The room had emptied slightly after the press conference, but the energy had not. A tall, sharp-suited man entered quietly and took the seat across from him. It was Isaiah, one of Thomas's longtime aides. More than just a staffer, he was a strategist, a fixer, and one of the few who knew the full depth of Thomas's reach. Isaiah glanced toward the television mounted on the wall, where a news ticker crawled beneath the looping footage of Craig's comments. Then he leaned in, lowered his voice, and said, "You want to know the real punchline to this whole thing?" Thomas looked at him, intrigued. Walton was shortlisted. Isaiah continued. Skylux's board had him pegged as a candidate for regional director of pilot operations. The internal interviews were scheduled for next quarter. Thomas raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Isaiah added, they thought he had backbone, stability, command presence. One of the execs described him as firm but fair. He shook his head slightly. Turns out he was just arrogant and short-sighted. Thomas's gaze didn't waver. He simply said, he showed them who he really was when he thought no one important was watching. Isaiah smirked, leaning back. And now, the board is tripping over themselves to reverse course. 2 of them already emailed me asking if you'd consider pushing the investment forward to show goodwill. Thomas nodded once, slowly. Let them wait. Meanwhile, down on the tarmac level, Craig Walton was sitting alone in the crew briefing room, his pilot wings still clipped to his jacket, but his badge revoked. A Skylux security manager had just handed him an envelope, a formal letter of suspension. The message inside was sterile, corporate, and unmistakably final in tone. Craig stared at it, his hands motionless, his mind racing through the collapse. Just yesterday, he had walked through terminals like a king, shaking hands, flashing that confident smirk, making offhand remarks with impunity. And now, he was a liability, a symbol of everything the company was scrambling to distance itself from. A pariah in uniform. He stood slowly, walked to the small restroom off the briefing room, and looked at himself in the mirror. For the first time in years, the reflection didn't look like a leader. It looked like a man who had never truly earned his rank, just carried it like a costume. In that same hour, an internal memo leaked from Skylux's HR department, confirming his suspension. Within minutes, industry blogs picked it up. Captain suspended after racism allegations from billion-dollar investor, read one headline. Skylux captain loses promotion over viral clip, read another. Recruiters from other airlines quietly removed his name from their watch lists. Training institutions scrubbed his quote from their promotional brochures. The morning air was thin and cold, but the sweat on his brow was unmistakable, not from the temperature, but from the avalanche of consequences still crashing down on him. Gone was the navy blue uniform. Gone was the polished swagger and clipped authority. What remained was a man in wrinkled clothes, clutching a cup of coffee with a trembling hand, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. "Mr. Walton," a reporter asked, her mic thrust forward, "do you have any comment on the investigation now that it's been confirmed the FAA has received a formal complaint from Thomas Reed's legal team?" Craig blinked, the name alone hitting him like another slap. He had heard it 100 times now on every channel, in every headline, always accompanied by the words billion-dollar investor, civil rights figure, or aviation reform leader. He managed a brittle no comment, but it came out cracked and hollow. Behind him, the porch light flickered weakly. His phone buzzed in his pocket for the 8th time that morning. Each new notification, either a news alert, a rejection, or another viral post dissecting his actions. A second reporter stepped in. "Mr. Walton, sources confirm that the National Pilots Union is reviewing your certification status, and that Reed's team has submitted video and audio evidence directly to the Civil Aviation Conduct Board. Are you prepared to lose your license?" Craig didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, yes, he was. And he knew it. Since the footage had gone live, his inbox had been flooded with emails from legal counsel, union reps, former colleagues, and PR firms he couldn't afford. The clip had been played on every network from CNN to TMZ, dissected by lawyers, activists, and influencers alike. But what truly sealed his fate wasn't just public perception. It was the evidence. Crystal clear audio of his own words. His voice, not taken out of context, but delivered proudly and without apology, mocking, belittling, and dismissing a man whose only mistake was refusing to be invisible. Thomas Reed had not simply exposed Craig's conduct. He had dismantled the system that allowed it. He had handed the footage, witness testimony, and boarding documentation directly to the FAA, with a formal request that the incident be treated as a precedent-setting review on racial discrimination in flight operations. And they had listened. The FAA had launched a formal inquiry. So had the Civil Aviation Conduct Board. And more damning still, the International Coalition of Passenger Rights had cited Craig Walton's case as the first fully documented in-flight civil rights breach involving a high-ranking private investor, a label that would forever haunt the search engines linked to his name. But perhaps the most devastating blow came just a day later. In a single email from Horizon Air Group, the charter company that Craig had hoped would be his escape plan after Skylux. The message was short, clinical, and final. "Dear Mr. Walton, after careful review of recent developments and public material, we regret to inform you that your application will not be moving forward. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." The rejection wasn't just personal. It was precedent. Word spread fast in the tightly networked world of aviation. Within 24 hours, Craig had received 3 more rejections, 2 silently, 1 with a curt voicemail. "We're looking for a different leadership profile." The message was clear. He had become radioactive. Even his pilot certification, once the pride of his life, was now under review. Social media piled on. Former flight attendants shared stories. A junior pilot anonymously posted about Craig's old-school condescension, which quickly racked up over 400,000 likes. And every day, the hashtag Justice in the Skies continued to trend, not as a wave of outrage, but as a campaign, a movement, and a reminder. Craig stayed indoors for most of it. He had sold his car, canceled his country club membership, and spent most of his days reading through news articles, emails he never answered, and the endless stream of comments that still popped up whenever someone searched his name. For the first 2 months, he was angry at Thomas Reed, at Skylux, at the internet. He blamed cancel culture, he blamed timing, and he blamed everyone but himself. But over time, in the quiet erosion of his reputation and the total isolation from peers and former colleagues, something unfamiliar began to take root. Regret. Not the kind born from consequences, but from clarity. It started when he watched the press conference again, not the clips, but the full recording, uninterrupted. He watched Reid's composure, the conviction in his voice, the weight of each word. He listened to the clips of his own voice layered afterward, each one now sounding less like confidence and more like cruelty. He rewound them. He studied his tone. He remembered the smirk on his face. And in that moment, he no longer felt framed. He felt seen. It was the first time Craig Walton stopped making excuses. And that night, for the first time since he lost everything, he wrote something that didn't sound like a defense. It was a letter, addressed to Thomas Reid. It began with a sentence he never thought he'd write: "I was wrong." He didn't hide behind phrases like misunderstanding or intent. He didn't try to dilute it with explanations. Instead, he wrote plainly, "I judged you before I knew you. I used my uniform like a shield and my cockpit like a throne. I silenced you not because you were disruptive, but because I didn't want to see someone like you in a place I thought belonged to people like me. That's not policy. That's prejudice. And I see that now." He sent the letter with no expectation, but he sent it. 3 weeks later, he received no reply, but the silence didn't bother him. He hadn't written it for redemption. He'd written it because it was true. With time, Craig began attending community programs on aviation ethics. At first, just as a guest, then as a participant. Eventually, a local equity initiative run by a retired black captain invited him to speak, not as an expert, but as a cautionary voice. He resisted at first. But when he stood in front of that small class of trainees, diverse, hopeful, and hungry for careers in the sky, something shifted. He told them the story, from the arrogance at the gate to the words spoken over the intercom, from the moment of humiliation to the weight of watching his own downfall played on national television. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't downplay it. He simply told the truth. When he finished, no one clapped, but no one looked away either. And that was enough. Within months, he began volunteering with flight academies in underserved communities, not to earn back a title, but to help younger pilots understand that skill without character was dangerous. He taught them about bias, not the kind they might face, but the kind they might carry. Slowly, his name stopped trending. His past didn't vanish, but it transformed, from scandal to story, from punishment to purpose. Meanwhile, Thomas Reid continued his work, quietly but powerfully. The $1.1 billion investment had moved forward, with a new clause ensuring mandatory civil conduct training for all Skylux flight personnel. He never replied to Craig's letter. He didn't need to. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day after the flight, Craig gave a talk at a regional airline training center. Afterward, one of the students, young, ambitious, and curious, raised his hand and asked, "Do you think people like you ever really change?" Craig didn't hesitate. "Not all of us," he said, "but some of us do once we stop seeing regret as punishment and start seeing it as the first step toward decency." The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it the public humiliation, the epic reveal, or the final redemption? And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.